here at the CSU Channel Islands, the ESRM program. What a delight it was to be invited today, especially so I could sit in on your, and also eat in on celebration, these great trips you have. I'm a big believer in going out in the field and taking students in the field. So that when I retired, I set up an award called the Marston Muddy Boots Award because I believe in going out and taking students in the field and collecting your own data because you understand the strengths and the weaknesses of your own data and probably do some better science in the very end. So this project was probably my favorite of all the years of work. For one thing, you can see the kind of scenery we were working in. We would raft to work every day on the river. But also because it was able to work with talented, motivated, and high-spirited students for 4 years in a place like this and come up with recommendations that the Park Service could use to help maybe change some of their management options. And I would say that this was typical of almost every project I worked on in my career, which is to say it turned out different than I would have guessed at the beginning. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's because you're kind of stupid yet. But, I think it's because nature is not simple, ordered, unified, and harmonious. It's kind of nasty in the sense that, it's yelling at us in a foreign language with a list. It wants to be understood, but you have to go out and collect the data, not just assume that what you read in the textbook is the case. And nature really is pretty complicated, but you can sort things out if you do a nice study over a period of time using multiple sources, not just fieldwork, but also with remote sensing data, GIS, and other historical archives. So that's what this study is all about. It was funded by the Park Service, as it says, and let's go on. By the way, let me ask, first of all, how many of you have been to Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming? Okay, so you might recognize this as a viewpoint called the Snake River Overlook. Okay, not sure how to advance here. Do I just
You have the pointer?
Here, I think.
You can do it with the pointer.
Oh, the pointer does it? Okay.
Should be.
Yeah, there we go. All right, now this project started because somebody came to me and said, Dr. Marston, we want to understand what effects has the dam in Grand Teton National Park had on bald eagles. I said, well, okay, well, let me think about it. I came back and said, well, to really understand the effect of the dam on bald eagles, you need to understand, first of all, the effect the dam has had on the river, then the effect that that has had on the habitat along the river, in other words, vegetation, and then we can start talking about the effects on wildlife. So let's talk about some of the resources related to the Snake River, beginning with this one. It's a corridor through the park that the river is and the vegetation along it, where you'll find elk, mule deer, antelope, and bison. So more than once we'd be rafting down the river, and there'd be bison swimming across the river. And of course, you don't really want to knock into one of those with a raft. I think the raft would end up with worse than that. But boy, the eyeballs are so large on these bison as you're floating by. We never did hit one, but we did see plenty of them along the way. And I guess one of my favorite animals would be the moose that you find, especially in winter. The moose congregate along the Snake River because they love to eat. Anybody know what plants they like to eat?
Willows.
Yeah, willows. They'll grab a big bunch of willows, which grow along the river, and just strip them. Run them through their mouth. And, more than once I was hiking along, and one time willows that were way over my head, and broke out into a little opening. There was a cow moose, a mother moose with its calf. And, moose can kill a person by kicking and stomping them. And I thought, I'm not here by myself, not smart. I could be trampled here, no one would ever find me. But I just a nice moose. I backed up very quietly into the shrubs, and you can see the breath come out of the cow moose nostrils, and it left me alone. So this is my favorite animal. So yeah, there are probably something like 600 moose that congregate along the river in the winter. And then these are trumpeter swans, beautiful birds that are endangered. They nest along the river and will rear young trumpeter swans, and also, of course, other shorebirds and ducks can be found along there. Right below Jackson Lake Dam, you see a number of pelicans. Why are they there? You're familiar with pelicans along the coast, right? Why would they be right below a dam, do you think?
Because the fish gets stuck.
Yeah, the fish can't, there's no ladder. So the fish congregate there, and, you know, it's feeding frenzy. They just dive in, gobble up all the fish they want. So the floodplain is also the habitat for beaver. And since I went to Oregon State, I'm kind of partial to beaver. And if you look at this image here of the floodplain, there are a lot of small streams like this. And boy, this is just ideal, isn't it, for building a beaver dam. And so in fact what's happened is a lot of formerly active streams on the floodplain have become attached to the floodplain. Because if you build a dam here, what's going to happen? You get silt behind it, and then vegetation comes in, and that's what's happening here. Even if the dams are blown out by a flood, it doesn't take long for the old channels to fill up. So guess what? These are sites that fish like to spawn at, the Snake River cutthroat trout. So fish habitat's been lost because of this process. So studies have been undertaken separately, just looking at the beaver and what they're doing. Whoa, what is this all about? One morning, just a couple of years ago, my students and I decided to put it in on the river maybe 6 in the morning. The water is, even in the summer, warmer than the air. Right, Linda? And so there's a steam fog coming up. So we come around the corner, and we're looking out on a point bar on the river, and there's a bunch of big animals out there. I said, oh, is this bear, or what? And look closer. It was a pack of wolves. Not in Yellowstone, in Grand Teton National Park. They were milling around, and there was probably the alpha male just locked eyes on me as we floated by. Big yellow eyes. And it was kind of creepy looking through the fog. I tried to take a picture, but my hands were shaking. This is not my picture. No, I took this off the internet, but it's kind of representative. I asked a biologist in the park later, what in the world are the wolves doing down there? I said, well, he put his finger to his lips and said, don't tell anybody. But yeah, there's a pack down there, and they're hunting beaver. I said, beaver? He said, they're hunting bank beaver. The Snake River is too wide and too fast and deep to build a beaver dam across the river. And so what they do, you saw where the beaver are, but if they are in the Snake River itself, they build their lodges in the banks, right? And then they'll go under water to get what they need, the wood and other forage. But this is easy pickings for the wolves. So they were just hanging around a big beaver lodge waiting for the beaver to come out. So that was interesting, and sadly, there was a wolf killed by somebody driving on the main road through the park, which in places goes very close to the river, one of these wolves from the pack. So that's how the news got out, eventually, that wolves were not only in Yellowstone, but down in the Tetons. Of course, now we know they're spreading all over the place. And anybody know about the news related to wolves in Wyoming? Wyoming is wanting to delist it as an endangered species. What Idaho already did. It looks like they're going to be successful doing that. So that ranchers can shoot them on sight. Anyway, they're also related to the Snake River. Now, anybody recognize our national bird? Remember, it could have been the turkey. That's what Ben recognized. Yeah. But yeah, if you get on the river early in the morning like that, you're going to see bald eagles nesting, maybe 4 or 5 places. They have these huge nests that they reoccupy every year. And also osprey. This is an osprey on the left. And if you're on the river early in the morning, chances are you might see one dive into the river and pull out a fish. If you go on a big tourist boat later in the day, probably you're not going to see this. But early in the morning, you will, and that's really a thrill, to say the least. So their habitat does depend, as you'll see, on the river. So, yeah, I mentioned the cutthroat trout. This is one that's been taken out. something like over $30 million is generated in the local economy by the people who pay fish guides, guided boat trips. And I asked about this one time, and you see a guy fishing here, and this guy here. What do you think he pays for a day on the river?
Too
No,
much.
it's $300. And this is unusual to see only one person. So maybe there's three. So you're going to pay $900. If any of you want to go, I'll only charge $100. I'm not a fisherman. I love to go boating down the river. In fact, I would say it's my favorite thing to do, the favorite way to spend the day. And I remember the trip that we took a couple years ago when we ran into each other out there in Jackson Hole. Besides the fishing trips, so of course there are just boating trips for people who want to take a raft trip down the river. I'm more say about that too. So in fact, here's a smaller version of some of the rafts that go down. Barker Rewing is one of the oldest companies that take people down. And this is the scenery. You see, as you're just floating around. And what I used to do is just I have my own raft and hydrologic research vehicle. To the IRS, that's how they do it. One of my favorite things to do is to take my classes from the University of Wyoming, and even sometimes from Kansas, all the way out here and go on raft trips. And we pull the oars in and just let the boat float and kind of turn in circles, and you see this panorama go by. And when I'm trying to fall asleep at night, that's what I kind of like to think about, is the memories of that. This is a wonderful landscape. And you can take all-day trips or a 4-hour trip if you want to go on a raft like that. And, the picture in the right there, what's that all about? What do you think happened there? Yeah, people, you can canoe down the river, but, as you'll see, some parts of the river have a lot of braided sections. And it's not difficult if you don't check in with the river rangers beforehand to take the wrong channel. And the phrase of wrapping your canoe around a log jam or underneath a log jam, that happens. And every year, sad to say, maybe an average couple people lose their lives drowning in perhaps water that's less than the height of a person, but they get trapped in a log jam. And it's sad, but it's part of what we were actually looking at. How does the river change over time, and what impacts would that have on recreational boating? Okay, so these biotic and recreational functions depend on the geomorphic and hydrologic linkages between the Snake River and its floodplain. So we proposed a bigger research project than just looking at the effects of the dam on bald eagles. We said these linkages are not well understood, and also we wanted to specifically look at the effects of Jackson Lake Dam. Now here's Jackson Lake Dam. It's not a huge dam, and you see the person here, like the pelicans, trying to take advantage of the fish that are cooled up here, but it does have impacts. Look at this aerial view, color. Aerial photograph of the river, and here's a section that has a lot of braiding going on. By the way, here's the major highway that goes from Jackson up to Yellowstone, and you can see a lot of braided channels. Imagine perhaps maybe choosing the wrong one if you're boating, and the consequences of that. Okay, so let's look at a map here to get oriented. So here's Jackson Lake. The Snake River headwaters are up here. This is an interesting location, by the way. Two-ocean plateau. Called that because there is actually no continental divide at that point. You have two streams coming down. They meet in a wetland. One flows off to the northeast. That's Atlantic Creek. And this one flows off to the southwest, and that's called Pacific Creek. And this area up here, heavy in grizzly bears. It really has no drainage dividing going on here. Anyway, the headwaters are up in Yellowstone, actually, and then come down into Jackson Lake, which was a natural lake before there was a dam. If you look at topographic maps from 1896, there's a lake there because a Pinedale Age Glacial Moraine Dam at the lake. You'll see some photos here of some of the versions of the dam that went in. Then the river comes out, flows down to Moose, where the big visitor center is. Maybe some of you remember that. Leaves the park and completely changes its nature as it flows on down here, eventually entering Palisades Reservoir, which straddles the border between Idaho and Wyoming. It plays a big part of the story in and of itself. This part of the river flows through a lot of private land and has levees along the river. I once saw Harrison Ford on a bulldozer pushing gravel up to build up the levee along his property, along the edge of the river. So everybody has their own little levee. Sometimes there's federal levees. They vary in their effectiveness. The river does not have a lot of the resource values here that it does in the national park. So keep this in mind, Palisades Reservoir. It's 42 miles from Jackson Lake Dam down to Moose. That was our study section, that 42 kilometer long section, about 26 miles. And a little bit different view. This is a MODIS image, if you're familiar with that, draped over a space shuttle digital elevation model. So now we're looking from north to south. Here's the Snake River coming in. Here's Jackson Lake, and here the dam would be right there, and the river comes out and down like this. And Moose would be right about there. And here's Palisades Reservoir. So the river comes through here. Lots of nice white water there, like white water wrapping on Snake. Then it comes into Palisades Reservoir. Okay. So look at this upper right image. Well, first look at this one here on the lower left. This is from that 1896 map before there was a dam at all. And here's a famous area. Notice the Oxbow. And now there's a big road comes through here, and lots of people stop here and take photographs of the Oxbow. But what happened was the first dam they put in, which only lasted from 1908 to 1910, built of logs. Would you build a dam out of logs? So it broke. What a surprise. And it created a nice flood downstream, which created probably a cutoff right here. But look at this. This is the breach of the dam after it broke. So then they rebuilt it. It took a few years, and by 1960, they had finished this concrete structure. This is what it looks like from the air. Now remember, what did I tell you created the natural Jackson Lake here?
The glacial moraine.
Yeah, it's a glacial moraine. So this dam, concrete dam, is seeded into a glacial moraine over here. Mm-hmm. On this side, it's tied into lake deposits, silts and clays from lake deposits. So it's not tied into bedrock at all. And keep in mind that the Teton Fault is right behind us. You see where the Teton Mountains are? It's maybe 3 miles away. So there's some danger there. Look at this. Here's a photo of the Teton Fault. I mean, it's so active. It's still active. Here's a debris slope created just from avalanches and so on. And probably about a 50-foot high scarp right here. So this goes all the way along the Tetons. And, a major earthquake could do some damage, right, to Jackson Lake Dam. So from 1984 to 1988, the Bureau of Reclamation drew down the reservoir level and spent $76 million trying to put 3 different cylinders all the way down, which they hoped would tie into bedrock. It never reached bedrock. It's just glacial and lacustrine sediments. So it's still not tied in to bedrock, which is what you want if you want a less stable dam. It's probably more stable than it was, but still somewhat of a risk. So we wanted to see what is the depth of the dam. And one way to do that is with what's called a cumulative mass curve. Now bear with me here. All we did was we figured out what is the average flow out of the dam. And then for each year, is that flow above or below the long-term average? You see a pretty striking pattern here. So here's when the strain gauge record started, in 1904. Here's when the first log dam was built, and here's when it washed out. Here's when the concrete structure went in. And what you see here are higher than average flows. You kind of leveled off during the drought of the 30s until 1956. And then what happened then? That's when Palisades Reservoir was built downstream. And that became the primary storage facility, replacing the function of Jackson Lake as a primary storage facility of water for irrigation farmers on the Snake River Plain in Idaho. So now most of the water could be stored in Palisades Reservoir, and you didn't need to store so much in Jackson Lake and then release so much in the spring. So the average flows coming out of Jackson Lake started tapering off. I lost the pointer here. You see where the blue curve is tapering down after 1957. And so obviously the Palisades reservoirs had a major impact. Here's another way to look at it. So here's a hydrograph for a year between October, the start of the hydrological year, going down to September. And let's look first at the purple curve, or pink curve, sorry. This is what the flow would have been like if there was no dam, all right? And then with the dam in place, then you go to 1912, 1956 with the dam, the actual flow. And you see the dam had caused lower flows in the Snake River in the winter because they're storing the water, right? This is not good for fish, but it's such low flows. And then the peak flows, what can you see? What's different about the peak flows with the dam than what would have occurred without the dam?
It's lower.
It's lower and delayed, okay? Because they're holding the water back for the irrigation season. Right? But then after Palisades Reservoir, you look at the purple and the green. What happened there is, look at this now. The peak flows were really cut down coming out of Jackson Lake Dam. Again, they didn't have to store as much. So think about what impact would that have on the river and the vegetation on the river. This was the first clue that we knew there were going to be big effects of the dam. Yet another way, if you're familiar with flood frequency diagrams, if you've taken some water resources classes, this is the probability of peak flows occurring, and here it is the magnitude of peak flows. So from 1957 to 1989, it looked like this, and in more recent years, in the older years, before Palisades, it looked like this. So one way to read this is the 20-year flood. In the old days, before Palisades would be, maybe 320 cubic meters per second. But now, the 5-year flood, I should say, with 20% chance of happening each year, would be maybe 250. So the dam cut down the peak flows. That's what I'm trying to say here. You have to do this kind of work to document in a quantitative way the impact of the dam on the river. So then we found as many maps and aerial photos as we could of the Snake River, including that early map, 1899, and then these other years leading up to 1989. And what you see over on the right here is the same section of the river at 1899, 1945, 1968, and 1983. See how different it is? This is the 100-year floodplain, which is the same. But the pattern of the river changes dramatically. So this got us excited. We knew that the changes in peak flows coming out of Jackson Lake Dam would have an impact, we thought, on the river. So nowadays, what do you think of when you see maps that change over time? We put this into a geographic information system. So that's what we did. Also, before I show the results, we did field surveys of the vegetation. What are we doing here? There's a tape laid out. Yeah, it's the same thing you did in Louisiana, right? This is the point, the line intercept method, right? We laid it out for 100 meters. We recorded the ground cover, the shrubs, the soil, everything in a 2-meter width going along here. And then every 25 meters, we did the point-centered quarter method. Did you do that? You measure in each quadrant, so northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest, the nearest tree and record the width and height of it. So we did trees, shrubs, grasses, and soils. And litter also. And that's my student, Jack Nelson. Let me tell a little story of Jack Nelson. Great student, but he was hard of hearing in 1 year. And so one morning we were out there early, and we wanted to get that out early in the field. And we laid out the tape. I set him down on the other end of the tape, and I was doing something. I looked up, and there was a big bull bison right next to him. And you could see in the early morning the breath coming out of the nostrils, and the eyes were getting bigger. And, oh my God, he's going to get gored or trampled or something. He didn't even hear this bison right next to him. So he survived. He went on to get his master's degree and then a PhD too, and become a professor. And now he's retired and learning. So he survived Marston, which is okay. So for those of you who like the vegetation surveys and are interested in all the gory details, we use cluster analyses to understand the makeup of the forest communities, and we developed a photo key. This is important, so we could relate the vegetation you were seeing in 1989 and into the 90s with what we saw in 1945 imageries. We didn't do fieldwork in 1945, but we could see what what those vegetation units looked like in 1945. So we could develop vegetation maps, overlay those with each other. And again, here's the same section of river. In this case, it's just two I'm showing. For 1945, we have a vegetation map. In 1989, we have a vegetation map. You see the river in black is quite different, and the mix, the mosaic of vegetation units is quite different. Remember the interest in what effect the dam has had on bald eagles? Bald eagles like this high-density blue spruce. They love to build their nests in the dead snags of these high, big, stable blue spruce. So look at the small amount of red along the river. By the way, that's my color pencil work there. And and then in 1989, it doesn't show it in this particular section, but there's actually more bald eagle habitat. And the moose, they like this orange shrub swamp vegetation. There was a lot of it in 1945 and less in 1989. Anyway, these are just two short sections, maybe 3 miles long. But we could put this in a GIS and show how has the vegetation changed from 1945 to 1989. That was pretty dramatic. Remember, because of the Palisades Reservoir down there, there's less disturbance of the floodplain. That's the key. Less disturbance of the floodplain. So instead of the river cutting through and wiping out different vegetation units, it's more stable. It's not completely stable. It's not channelized. It still would cut through vegetation and change it. But you can see more natural succession. Unvegetated units becoming covered with grass. Then the willows come in. Then low-density cottonwood trees. Then a mixed stand of cottonwoods and old blue spruce. But once the cottonwoods get higher, once the blue spruce get higher than the cottonwoods are not tolerant of the shade. It's just like throwing the light switch off. They die almost overnight. So that's how you get a mixed stand of blue spruce and cottonwoods turning into a pure stand of high density blue spruce trees over time. Again, this is what it looks like. So that succession happens more now because the dam is causing less disturbance. So we could come up with quantitative measures of biodiversity. How evenly is the floodplain covered in each of these vegetation types? This is the statistics that is used. As you look at this, what kind of changes would you foresee for this kind of environment right here? Here's a mixed forest of cottonwoods and blue spruce. The cottonwoods are taller right now than the blue spruce. And these are the old channels that used to migrate through the floodplain. What's going to happen here on this site?
Blue spruce are going to outgrow the cottonwoods and then they'll die.
Yes,
and they'll
because
fall into that floodplain and probably braid it because they'll make little debris patches maybe.
Yeah, okay, so with the river flooding less, these channels aren't going to be cleared out every year. So beaver come in, and this will be dammed. In fact, these are probably logs cut by a beaver. And this will eventually silt in, turn to grass, eventually to cottonwood trees and so on. And this will be, solid ground without the old channels in there. And yes, the blue spruce trees will grow because this will not be wiped out by subsequent floods. And as soon as the blue spruce get taller than the cottonwood trees, this is cottonwood here, the cottonwoods will disappear. Okay, so results. Interesting. Remember I said that this is one of these studies where it turned out different than I would have expected. So there's opposite changes depending where you are along the river. This is an aerial view of Jackson Lake in the upper left-hand corner. The dam is right there. River comes out. You see that cutoff? Push this over there. Can you see the oxbow up there and the cutoff? Remember I showed you when that probably happened? So now that's a very popular place to take photographs. The river's pretty much a single thread channel until Pacific Creek comes in here and the Buffalo comes in here. Then look what happens. A single thread channel turns into this braided complex mosaic until you get a certain distance away from the additional sediment. Then the river can't, because it doesn't flood as much, you can't move it. You can't move the sediment downstream. And so the channel is actually more stable here. Look how straight it is right there. And you can see old oxbows and meander scars around. And so the channel is more stable for most of the length, but less stable just downstream of sediment sources. So it's a great example from fluvial geomorphology of a change, the dam, causing opposite changes at different places along the river. This is what geographers like to say, place matters. It's not just one direction of change. So that was interesting. So here's an example of one of our GIS outputs. Now we use Idrisi, an old version where you have 1.1 hectare size pixels. Each one of these pixels is 1.1 hectares. And what we did is made a map of how long has it been since the river was last in each of these pixels. So we could see what vegetation was in these pixels.
There's a pointer there.
Okay.
Top button there is a pointer.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so, the blue would be, that's where the channel was in 1989. We get down to the brown, that's where it was 90 years ago. And so now we look at vegetation and you can figure out how long does it take to develop each vegetation unit. So here are the results from that. And, down here, look at the bottom, that's probably the most interesting part, where you see it takes 56 years after the river has left a part of the floodplain before you get a pure stand of blue spruce. It's dark in there. There's nothing growing on the ground. It's just blue spruce. And you see the amount here shown there. All right, so we wanted to do some studies of some measurements of biodiversity at the community level. And that's what this graph shows. In green, it shows what percent of the floodplain is covered by each vegetation unit in 1945. So 5%, 6% maybe unvegetated. Looks like about 20% grass. The most dominant unit was this willow alder shrub swamp community, right? And then there's the cottonwood stands, the mixed stands of cottonwood and blue spruce. And here in 1945, a small amount of floodplain covered in blue spruce. Orange shows what it had become by 1989. So what are the big changes here? Let me see. Look at the willow alder shrub swamp community. It's been cut 60% in area.
I got that's worse than I got.
Okay.
You guys are old school.
All right, thanks. That was one too. Yeah, and so, do you remember what charismatic animal loves the shrub swamp community? Moose. So they've lost 60% of their habitat. Remember, 600 moose roughly live down there and eat the willows during the winter. And so what's gaining? Well, the forested communities, especially look at the blue spruce. So would you say that the changes in the way that Jackson Lake Dam, the changes in how water was released after Palisades Reservoir went in, are those changes good or bad for most?
Bad.
Good or bad for bald eagles? Good. All right, so it's kind of a mixed bag, right? And so we could come up with, remember that equation I showed you, how to measure relative evenness, one way to measure biodiversity. And so in 1945, that's the value for biodiversity at the community level. And by 1989, biodiversity had improved. In other words, look at the pylons here. Which is more even? Neither one is even. But which is more even? The green or the orange? Orange slightly, yeah. And so we can project. What about the next 45 years? So by 2033, it should improve a little bit more. Now here's another interesting lesson. The biodiversity at the community level has improved. But the most diverse community measured by number of species is this one, the willow, alder, shrub, swamp community. Our vegetation surveys showed that the greatest diversity of species is in this, and the lowest diversity is in this. Only blue spruce, nothing else is growing in there. So you could say at the species level, biodiversity has decreased, but at the community level, it's increased. Isn't that interesting? At least I thought. All right. So we could also, using GIS, this is what my grad students figured this out. They're much smarter than I was. He said, well, you know, we could look at the vegetation units that were disturbed, that were wiped out by the river during this 45-year period, and figure out which ones are most easily destroyed and which ones are most resistant to the river cutting a new path through them. That's what this complicated looking table shows. This column on the right shows that, of course, unvegetated areas, very easy for the river to cut through there. But blue spruce, once you get those blue spruce trees in, it's hard for the river to knock those over. Even though the roots are very shallow, you just go in the ground and spread out. But they're anchored pretty well there. So it looks like just in the exact order, almost the exact order that you would get with succession, also shows the relative susceptibility of those vegetation units to being destroyed. And that's how we can project what would happen in the future. All right, so conclusions. Jackson Lake Dam has reduced the magnitude and frequency of peak flows since 1957. Before 1957, actually, the flooding, as was noted here, was pretty similar to what it was with the dam and what it would have been without the dam. We could figure that out. But since 1957, peak flows have really been cut down, at least in half. And then we get a complex response of the Snake River to reduce flooding. It's more stable for most of its length, but in areas where sediment is being added from tributaries, it's less stable. It's meandering more and breaking. So the floodplain vegetation overall has shifted from a flood pulse disturbance type regime to a more terrestrial-like linear succession like you would expect with no disturbance. The vegetation units that we measured, those 6 units, contrast in their susceptibility to destruction by channels shifting. And that's why the future is going to be different than the past. So, are these changes for Jackson Lake Dam good or bad? All right. I don't really like dams personally. I like free-flowing rivers, whitewater rafting, and all this. But you know, what did the science show? It showed that the dam actually was beneficial for biodiversity as measured by relative evenness for communities at the landscape scale. The changes in the river and its floodplain were beneficial for bald eagle habitat. There's more of it now than there used to be because there's more blue spruce and more snags where they like to build these big, huge nests. For boating safety, it's beneficial because there's fewer opportunities to make wrong choices as you go down the stream. There's still a few areas you can get in trouble, but overall, it's pretty much neck down to a single thread channel. And you see fewer accidents than you used to in the past. But there are adverse effects. And we've mentioned these in passing, but the biodiversity at the species level has declined because of the enormous decline of the shrub, swamp, the willow, neem. And for winter moose habitat, big loss of willows. Now, I haven't talked to any wildlife biologists who told me that this has made a difference for the moose themselves, because they can migrate far and wide. So I'm not going to take the next leap there, but at least for amount of area that you can use, it's the best. What about fish habitat? What did I say about that? If you are causing fewer floods to cross the floodplain and flush out these small little streams, keep the beaver from colonizing these areas, you're going to lose those small streams, which the Snake River cutthroat loves to use for spawning habitat. Okay? So look at this, equal number of beneficial and adverse impacts. When we gave this report to the Park Service, they really were a little bit surprised, and they always want to have some direction how to go. So a book was written a few years, well, actually in the middle of our work, by Tim Palmer. Some of you might be familiar with this writer, kind of a conservationist. He wrote a book on the Snake River. I recommend it. And he met with Marshall Gingery, who at the time was the superintendent in the park. And here's what Marshall had to say. We could study the effects of the dam, but we couldn't expect anything to happen. If you think that Park Service decisions are based on biology, you're wrong. Then he said, Tim wrote, a ray of optimism, a University of Wyoming hydrologist under a park contract will consider geomorphology below the dam. We have a long way to go, Gingery said, but a new generation of managers will be able to use scientific data. I think the American people want to take better care of the parks. Aren't we looking at these same kind of conflicts today? How much are we going to use science in our park decisions? So, I've been trying to keep track. You saw that 1989 was the most recent map. Okay, so how many years ago was that now? 28. Okay, so here's some interesting data. The number of people going down the Snake River is much higher than what, even in 1996, it's much higher than the carrying capacity, maybe 50% higher. And so in the 90s, the National Park Service joined with other agencies, 15 different federal and state agencies, to develop the Snake River Corridor Project. And imagine 15 state and federal agencies trying to hammer out some explanations. They looked at not only the section in the park, but also going all the way down to Palisades Reservoir. But the focus of this was primarily on recreational boating, because so much money is generated from that. So the corridor plan looks at how many launches per day of boats carrying fishermen and tourists. Where should they be launched from? How do we preserve historic sites, old ranches, maybe along the river? But the state of Wyoming, they've taken it a step further, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department specifically, they purchased water from the Bureau of Reclamation to enhance the winter low flows. Remember how low the water dropped because of the dam? That was hurting the Snake River cutthroat trout and other species like otters and ermine that live along the river. So to their credit, they've purchased water to help with the winter low flows. Now, is this going to make a difference for flooding and disturbance of the floodplain? No, it doesn't. So why hasn't more happened there? Well, the Bureau of Reclamation is a different agency than the National Park Service. Completely different mandates, right? Some of you have taken classes about national parks and public land policy. So the Bureau of Reclamation could care less about moose habitat or bald eagles. They just need to provide water downstream for the irrigation farm. So it's been a tough road to hoe to get the National Park Service and Bureau of Reclamation to do anything about the peak flows. Also, probably you'll never see more peak flows because now there are a lot of cabins along the river. And I know some people who own a couple of those cabins. I don't know Harrison Ford, but there's people below the park who would not like to see higher peak flows because they're flooding. What else is happening? Well, game and fish Department in Wyoming is doing habitat restoration because the spawning sites are being lost for the Snake River cutthroat trout in the park. They're doing some things to try to restore habitat elsewhere. They have a big hatchery, okay, so they can do that. And they're also bringing in gravel in other areas outside the park to enhance habitat there. And so what about the peak flows? Well, all this plan says there's the need to explore changes in the flow, how they affect vegetation, and how they affect wildlife. So really that's kind of just brushing aside all these findings we found and just letting the environment continue to change. So as we look at this beautiful part of the world, Jackson Lake Dam, right here. Maybe the dam's not beautiful, but Jackson Lake certainly is. And here's the river coming on down. Here's the Oxbow, and right here, and the cutoff. There's a park road that comes right here. If you visit the park, you'll probably stop and take photographs. Here's Pacific Creek bringing in cobbles. I walked 26 miles up this stream. The particle size never changed. It's going through fluvial glacial sediments that all around cobbles. And all that material ends up in the Snake River, and because the peak flows are not as great, the snake cannot move that gravel down. You can pretty much wade across the river right there. And it accumulates down here and creates all these gravel bars. Here comes the Buffalo Fork, which does not bring in cobbles, it brings in sand. And anyway, the combined effect of cobbles and the sand is create a lot of grading here. But you can see that the river, it's almost entirely a single thread channel until you get further down here, and there's some grading because the floodplain gets wider, and then moose is right down here. So it's quite a different environment now than it was in the first half of the last century, and that's had impacts on a number of pieces in the wildlife puzzle. I told you about the encounter I had with a moose, and I saw moose along the river a lot. And I turned my back and write some data thing, some comments down in my book. I kept thinking I'd hear laughing, and so I kept turning around. What is this? And so finally, at the end of the project, I turned around just in time to catch this. This little fellow is thinking, thanks for trying to keep some habitat. So thanks for listening. Thanks for coming tonight. And if we have time, I'll be happy to answer some questions.